question that we ask in today's session is human nature. Deep down inside, are we good or are we bad? If left to do whatever it is that we desire, are we going to do more good? Are we going to do more bad? So we touched on this in the first two sessions about morality. Are we going to help? Are we not going to help? Are we going to save the child? Not save the child. Are we going to sacrifice ourselves or sacrifice our suit or sacrifice our money or not? So inherently, inside, are we good or are we bad? So the first question that I have for you here is, rather than us using our own intuition, what classic findings do you know in social psychology that give us some sense of whether we're good or bad? Anybody recall from introduction to psychology? What do we know? What experiments have we learned about that can tell us whether we're good or bad? It's today. We're very good. Milgram is one of the classics in social psychology, definitely in every course, and in social psychology, and also in every psychology. And this came after the Second World War, where the world was trying to figure out how could it be that people in Germany, in this region, people in Japan, followed orders in order to do all kinds of unimaginable horror to other people. Killing, torturing, mass murder, genocide, and all that. So Milgram was one of the people who tried to understand what is going on with human nature. We thought people are good, but look what happened in Germany, what happened in Japan. Maybe we need to uncover how could it be that people follow these components. So Milgram allegedly was about obedience. It was a experimenter in a white coat telling a participant to give shocks to another participant. There was deception. We talked about deception last time. So there was no really anybody getting hurt, but they heard somebody yelling. At some point, no more yelling. Administering increasing levels of electric shocks. And whenever they felt like they don't want to proceed, they said, "Oh, we don't want to do this." The experimenter in the white coat said, "You must proceed. This is the experiment. You must proceed." It turns out that a large proportion of people succeeded all the way to the end with very fatal electric shocks. Gilad, the participant, did not respond anymore. Very good. Classic experiment. Anything else? What else do we know about? Think about human nature? Yeah, what is that about? It's not just social psychology, but there is a social aspect to it. That is what developmental, so these were kids seeing adults really do harm to a doll. But it looks a little like a human. It's a very funny video to look at this and goes down and comes back up. But the horror of this whole thing is that if the kids were seeing adults behave in a certain way towards that doll, it seems like they behave in a certain way. So this was social learning. We learn by observing, we learn by imitating. Very good, Andrew. So it seems like we have a few more. Stanford prison experiment. We're going to talk about that one. What made it an experiment? Is it an experiment? Very good. We'll talk about this. Doll experiment. Very good. Little outlook experiment. Yeah. Very, very good. So when we look at these things and we have these titles, for example, Stanford experiment, what makes this an experiment? The experiment typically has something like random assignment, has some kind of basic principles of design that make it an experiment. So if there is a case study, for example, little owlet, is it an experiment? Did we manipulate anything? Or is it just an observation? So even in the title of the Stanford prison experiment, what is it that made it an experiment? In Milgram, what made it an experiment? What is the experimental procedure, the manipulation that turns this into? Very good. So thanks for sharing that. We're going to touch on almost all of these. I'll just tell you about Rutger here. Because Rutger here surprised me very much during the pandemic. So during the pandemic, where things were not going very well in the world, suddenly he comes out with this book. And this book is a very hopeful and optimistic book, very unlike anything that we've seen in psychology. Typically in psychology, the books that come out are very skeptical and cynical about human nature. But here has humankind a hopeful history. Is that it really surprised me because I've been at that point giving lecture at the HBU for 3 years. And for the first time, I've seen a book that summarizes what is it that I teach that is very different from what the social psychology books will let us know about it. So I went on Twitter and I wrote all these things. I did a hike, listened to this whole thing on Dragon's Back. And at the end of this, I thought this is amazing because it covers everything that I taught in advanced social psychology the 3 years before that. If you want another inspiring book, so the previous one that he did is Utopia for Realists, we're trying to show actually we can implement algorithms in order to help the world and implement a lot of things that assume the good in people. And when we assume the good in people, then good outcomes come out. So he's offering a realistic perspective of how to implement good in the world in order to get good come out of it. And here, for the first time, he tackled a lot of the findings in social psychology to question them. When we hear about the prison experiment, is it true or not true? Right. So one of the things that he covers a lot of case studies but things that people would have us believe about ourselves, the way that we're portrayed in Hollywood or in some of the famous books. But then he also gives the counter. He goes on and does a very good historian journalist job in interviewing the people over there and giving us a perspective of what really happened. So classic example in Hollywood is what happened in that Titanic. So this is a little bit like the scenario in Planet A and Planet B. Instead of an airplane, we've got a sinking ship. So it hit ice. It's supposed to be an indestructible ship, going very, very fast. And then finally, it was about to go down, and there were not enough floats on there. So what was the situation? How did people react in that kind of situation? So this is Hollywood. Very scary. By human nature, there's chaos. Everybody wants to get on that boat. You need to fend off with a pistol in order to get them not to come on the boat. This is really what happened in the Titanic. So if you would just watch the Hollywood movie, then your assumption of human nature is that this was what happened. But actually, when you look at the books that came out, for example, there's this, the story of the Titanic is told by survivors. So there were survivors, and they were interviewed about what actually happened during the Titanic. Actually, there was no indication of panic or hysteria. There were no cries of fear, no running to and from. If anything, people helped one another. Elderly, the women, the kids were escorted to the ship, and these are the ones that actually survived at the end. And actually, there was acceptance, there was helping one another. So nothing of the Planet A, nothing of the Planet B that we assumed about each other. It was more about Planet A helping one another, supporting each other, and even in moments of crisis where we'd expect everybody to be very selfish and just want to save themselves, actually what happens in reality is much closer to kind of the good times of us helping each other. This is the classic one from Tom over here. So he's a professor of social psychology at the University of Groningen. He's the one who was interviewed by Rocker. So Planet A, the good one, Planet B, the bad one. So it seems like we're much closer to Planet A. This is how he, after giving this many, many times in Groningen to all of the students, this is what he summarizes. I would estimate like 97% of people think that we live on Planet B, whereas in reality, we live much closer to Planet A. It doesn't matter who you ask, left wing or right, rich or poor, they don't know, freshmen or juniors. And it's not for lack of research. We've had this information all along, but actually we have not communicated this very clearly. So as researchers, whenever we're told something about human nature, we need to look at that combination of evidence. So my knowledge, Roger, as a historian, is the first one who just does a book, 600 pages, trying to summarize all of the evidence, showing us that we actually have a lot more good in us than we do. Here is another classic experiment in social psychology, one of the biggest. So we talked about the number one biggest experiment in social psychology ever. This is the moral machine, about Holly dilemmas and what happened, how the people react. And this is to try and help self-writing autonomous labels. But we also ran this amazing experiment published in Science, you can see over here, in 2019. And we wanted to get to know better understanding of what is happening with us. Do we help one another or not? Are we good or are we bad? And had a very interesting research question in a very interesting way to test this research question. So try and think, if you're a researcher, let's say that you have an unlimited budget and you want to test whether people will help or not. How would you test this? So they came up with this very interesting civic honesty around the globe. They decided to lose a lot of wallets in various spaces all over the world. They put varying amounts of money in those wallets and just left them out there. In the wallets, there were details with the email address of the person who owns the wallet. And the research question is, will people return the wallet or not? Anybody ever had the experience of losing a wallet? No? Did you get your wallet back? Yeah, you did. Was it in Hong Kong? Yeah, both of you guys back. No, you didn't get it back? Okay. You didn't go. Yeah. How did you get it back? Oh, the staff on it and you get it. Okay, great. What did you do with it? And then back to what happened? I just did contact. It was gone. Did you try to contact it? Yeah, I didn't try to contact it. Yeah, happened really well. Exactly that kind of story. You can see much like what's going to happen. And if you do this on a global scale, you have a lot of interesting questions that go beyond the average. Maybe there's a cultural difference, and maybe there's a difference between the way that we do this if we do this in slightly different ways. So let's say I just give you this as an example. I will tell you exactly what it is that they've done. But let's say I tell you the paradigm is losing wallets. And you want to see something about human nature. Put on the scientist hat. and try to think, how would you conduct this experiment? What would you do in order to test human nature? What would you vary? Would you manipulate? What would you want to know? What are the variables? What would you measure? What are good ways to look at human nature if you have something like losing waters? What people do? The return. Yeah, so that's a very good kind of how many of them are returned? Very good. You have like a hypothesis. More than 50, less than 50, how many waters are returned? Less than 50, very good. So that seems like a very good main effect, a very clear dependent measure. Thank you for that. Great. Anything else that we can measure?
Yeah, value.
Yeah, very good. So we need a certain amount of money in the wallet. And the question is, how much of this will actually come back to us? Maybe the ideas will come back, but not the money. If it's the money, how much of the money? So we can leave different things, different amounts of money, and then we can see how much of that came back. Very good. So we have this dependent measure of how many wallets, but maybe that doesn't give us the whole picture. Maybe we need to do something a bit more nuanced about how much of this came back. Very good. Anything else? What else is interesting for you? Yeah, very good. So if we need more or if we need less money, how would this impact the main factor or the return of the wallet? Very, very good. So we can start to manipulate the factors like the amount of money, and maybe have only money or have something else. Very good. Want to say something?
How much was the person are doing to find the founder of the water, like find or
very good. So we can use different kinds, varying levels of efforts in order to contact the person. If it's an email, it's maybe a little bit straightforward. Maybe there's something a little bit more complicated about, I don't know, maybe there's an address and you need to go to the address. What other kinds of effort would you put in? Different ways to contact, some of them are more, some of them are less, and the phone number, or requires somebody, something like that. We can think about the different factors. We're very good manipulating the amount of effort that is required. And this is actually all of these factors that you raised actually became very important here. I'm just doing something about the taxi stuff. It's very, very difficult if you don't know the license plate to get in touch with the taxi driver. But turns out I didn't know that there's a service in Hong Kong where you can pay 800 Hong Kong dollars in order to broadcast to all the taxi drivers. I don't know who this is, like has this thing open all the time, but you can broadcast this for 3 days or something like this. And if a taxi driver happens to listen to this and want to give you a wallet back, then they will try to get that for you. So it depends how much money you have in there or what kind of ideas you have in there and how much money you carry in your wallet. But interesting that there is this kind of service I did not know. And I had this dilemma whether I want to activate this or not, because the amount of money that I had was almost insignificant compared to that, but I had some important ideas that I didn't want to do. All right, so what did they do over there? So they had a lot of varying manipulations. You can see already it's very, very impressive. Just imagine how much research grant they need in order to do 17,000 wallets all over the world. They need a lot of research participants and staff. 365 cities in 40 countries. And they did vary the amounts of money. So would this affect the rate of return? We don't really know, right? So what would happen? So when we ask people to predict what would happen, how many people would return, what is the rate of return when people have money or don't have money in the wallet? So you can see that what people, non-experts, let's say we are non-experts, what would people predict? So they predicted a little bit more optimistic than less than 50%. So they predicted most people with no money would return this. So maybe ID, it's very important, so we will return this amount. If there's money, maybe a little bit less. If there's big money, even lower than that. So I think the assumption here, the assumption that most people have, and this is prediction markets, asking people, what do you think will happen? Most people assume that people are selfish and they're money-oriented, and the more money that there is, the less the rate of return. Interesting. Then they asked experts, what do you think? And they thought, okay, just about the same. But still, if there's a lot of money in there, maybe they won't see the wallet. But what they end up happening, what they end up experiencing over here, is that when there was no money, actually the return rates were already quite good, like 40%. But relatively low. If there's no money, maybe there's no need to return this. But if there's more money, some money in there, people tend to return this more. But if there's big money, people even increase this to 70% return. So this is an average all over the world. So already you can see here, and this is very useful for you, if you run an experiment and you think some people might say that my results are intuitive, you can actually go to a different sample and ask what people actually predict and then show that your results are not intuitive. So here you can see a very big difference between what happened in reality, what they found out, and what people assumed. If we go back to the breakdown, you can see over here the money and no money. The red is always higher than the orange, maybe aside from Mexico, which is like an interesting thing. Here, Chile is a little bit close to each other. But overall, you can see that the rate's somewhere in between, around 50%, which is, before I read the results, this is a lot higher than what I expected people to bring back their wallets. And if we look at this classroom, we only have 2 cases, one gather, one pack, and one did. But it's interesting, 50%, right? So this is overall 17,000 wallets. Now, there's other things over here. So for example, you can look at cultural differences. So what happens between Poland, the United Kingdom, and the United States? It seems like the United States and the United Kingdom are about the same. Poland is a little bit higher than them. What is it about Poland? We don't really know. What else do you see? What other questions do you have? What other observations do you see? So as scientists looking at these kinds of results, what pops out? Definitely a Western sample, very Caucasian, but in people. So already we can look at the names of the researchers and see and ask, maybe the researchers have some bias. Maybe they don't understand China well. Maybe they have bias against China in some way. So I think this is already showing very good critical mindset. But when we see something surprising like this in China, we live in this region, we see what's happening here. We want to ask, what's happening over here? Why are all these, that happen to be similar countries to where the researchers are very high over here? And why we have over here all kinds of countries that are not included in the researchers that actually conducted the study. And then we can come up with all kinds of hypotheses to be tested. So I like these hypotheses very late. Perhaps they didn't sample this very well. Maybe they went to one region that has some kind of problem. Maybe they don't understand something about the content. So we need to ask, and I'm going to come back to this because I have a whole section about this. Very good. Thank you for that. Anything else comes to mind here? What else do you see?
Concepts as well. I think the people that are concept knowledge,
very good. We're looking at the social context. Good. Sensitivity to money, and we can measure this like on a country level in GDP per capita. So we can see definitely already all these Scandinavian countries, very, very wealthy, very well developed economies, right? So we can try and look at this. Yes.
Yeah, that was my experience. I just noticed and comparing so not one of the richest regions in the world, but they are not record on as well as.
Exactly. So I like this because you identified 2 factors, social and economic factor that might be relevant. So we need to ask you something. I really like it that you're looking at this with a very big point. We're going to take the case study of this China story. Because when this came out in Hong Kong, South China Morning Post was really pissed about this. And this is nothing compared to what happened in China. So a lot of people were enraged about it from this region. So here's only how they frame this. So Chinese score lowest in the European American research team, but honestly, what method might be flawed? So very, very interesting to do this, and they look at all kinds of things. We already raised some hypotheses for why this might be. So let's try and think together. What is different about China, or maybe some of these countries that are lower over here? What is different about it compared to the other sample? What might explain China being the lowest on this? So I'll tell you what the South China Morning Post said, but first I want to get your insights. What do you think happened there? What could go wrong in this kind of study if you wanted to? Could be location. Maybe they didn't do this. Maybe it's
people who are directly there's one directly.
So maybe the method is a little bit different. Maybe instead of giving it back to the actual person, there's a reason for them to give it back to the police or something like that. Very, very good. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But it could be something might be blocked with the numbers you can, and oh my gosh, because we like Google Maps, everything just seems a lot more complicated. Plus, a lot of people don't use email at all. What do they use? WeChat, right? They use some other method of communicating with each other. And email almost seems maybe like a corporate thing or something that people don't use very often. Very, very good. street vendor who try to give them cash. And then I'm not scan the wallet of WeChat Pay or Alipay in Hong Kong now works in China, which is great. So they don't even know what to do with money. Try and pay you or a taxi with cash. They'll be very upset with you. So no more wallets. The wallet is your mobile phone, right? So maybe they don't even know how to react to it. So very good e-payment is the way to go. People don't have wallets the same way they used to anymore. So a lot of things came up. One of the things was that the way that actually the context in China is that they left this in a public hotel and they were expecting the receptionist or somebody walking through the hotel to notice the wallet and then send it back. But just like all we said, maybe there's a different way that they handle this whole thing. And then people in China were discussing, receptionists working on a counter under very high pressure, and there's a lot of people passing through, and maybe they don't want to assume any kind of responsibility while they're, tending to the other duties. So a lot of reasons came out of that. In addition, most Chinese citizens don't use daily communication email. They pay for it by mobile phone. So now you can start thinking about things critically. So now suddenly we want to ask, maybe we should have evolved from China in order to run this in China rather than the Westerners coming in from the West and saying, now we need to run this in China, let's just use wallets. If I, with my very broken Mandarin, need to do anything in China, I'm completely lost. Plus, I also see how people react to me, like a Caucasian person walking around. Kids think that I'm a big attraction. People just get talking in English. So I can't even imagine how the researchers did over there. So we might want, at the very least, to look at the supplementary materials or contact the researchers and say, wait, what did you do over there? How did you run this in China? Critical mindset, right? All the time, ask questions. Don't take things for granted. Now, how would we know if this actually works in China or not? How does this work in China? For a very long time, we did a lot of verifications here at HU, and I was really hoping that one of the students would want to do some wallets with me in China. This was a fantasy, but a lot of money in there. We don't have this kind of grant money. But luckily, we need replications, but I could run this. Luckily, somebody 2 years ago decided to run this. So when you see a finding that you don't like or you don't agree with, and you want to test this yourself, this is great. You run a replication. You try to do exactly the same thing again. And this is exactly what these Chinese testers did. They decided to use wallets again in various places, so sampling more places in China. They're doing things like, instead of just leaving a Gmail, also leaving a WeChat, and also doing other kinds of factors. So you can see just from there, a lot of researchers went into this, and they really criticized the original one in science. So we conducted an extended replication study in China, utilizing email response and wallet recovery to assess the response. We found significantly higher levels of silicons. So it seems like when they conducted this, understanding the context in China and implementing in different places, they got much higher responses of people actually returning the wallets, which is really interesting. In addition, they asked for the data. They said, can we please look at the data from China? Something looks very interesting to us. Can you please share this with us? So they got the data and they did something like a reanalysis. And they looked at the various places where they lost things in China, and they did some correlation with something called individualism, collectivism. And they were trying to see, we talk about socioeconomic factors. One of the cultural factors that people typically look at is whether people or cultures are collectivistic or individualistic. So whether we look at things as belonging to a person, or whether we look at things politically. So it could be, if we look at things holistically, then we will share this with the police. If we look at this individually, then we want to return this to the actual person. So maybe people want to think about wallets as something different, that belongs to individual, maybe belongs to community or something like that. And they found support for this. So it seems like people in China were very happy about the study. They can go and look at this. They ran this in various places. In Cohen, they ran this in the science paper. They ran this in 8 places. They ran this in 10 places. You can see the overlap over here. So they added Hardin, and they looked at all sorts of other things. And luckily, the Chinese were very happy with it. South China Morning Post and China Daily. Finally, the record has been corrected. Team sets record straight on Chinese citizens, honestly. So it seems like everybody is happy here. So maybe we learned something. We have the science paper in 2019 saying something about generally the globe in terms of honesty. But then one group of people in China were not happy about it. So maybe this is like the end of it. Is it the end of it? It rarely is. Because in science, we have a lot of debate. So just reading the 2019 is not enough. You need to go on Google Scholar, cited by, you press cited by, and then you write keywords like replication to see have people repeated this. Have people done meta-analysis of this. So don't just look at what was published originally, but also follow up on Google Scholar to see what was the things that came up after this, what was the follow-up by other researchers on that research. So maybe the original authors from the West had something to say about this. And indeed, it continued again and again. Science is not a conclusive statement about what is true and what is not true. Science is more like a debate, conversation between different researchers trying to add more and more evidence in order to get closer to the truth. And here you can see the reply, a closer look at civic honesty in collectivistic cultures, and they found all kinds of problems in the analysis that the Chinese people ran, Chinese professors, saying, actually, you did things wrong, we did things right. Then, of course, they get the chance to respond to this. So the Chinese professors responded to this. So they did the verification, they did the estimation, they did the reanalysis, they found an error, they kind of corrected the error and added the materials to this. So it's just like very bizarre thing that goes on in science where sometimes there's so many back and forth on this that you don't know what the actual conclusion is for this whole story. So whenever there's somebody that comes to you and tells you, I know what human nature is, there's a science paper in 2019, hear my TED Talk, buy my book, and follow my advice. Nothing is this conclusive in science because science is messy. We increase our knowledge all the time when we update our understanding of who we are and what we're about. Okay? So whenever somebody tells you there's an extreme story, there's one study that was done, I don't know when, 2019, and you need to ask yourself, is this really true or not? So I'm telling you this as an interesting case study of how we should approach science. And even with science, things are published in the biggest journal, Science, covering 17,000 words. Some people say, we don't need any more experiments. We've done this once. China is the lowest. Nothing to say anymore. You need to question, put a critical mindset, scientist hat on, and ask questions. Okay. All right. I'll start a little bit with the bystander effect, and I'll give you the grade a little bit later on. Would we help a stranger? So the bystander effect, we talked about wallets. The wallets don't have an interaction with another person. What happens when we have an interaction with another person, the person who we need? What do we typically do? So here's a stand-up comedian that I follow. He's very, very cynical. He's based in New York. And this is what he had to say about people helping others in New York.
I like living here. You'll see things in New York you don't see other places. Yeah. I was walking on Fifth Avenue. I came across a man that was laying there on Fifth Avenue bleeding. Other people walking by him. I couldn't believe it. I was the only one that had my phone out recording him.
Why are we cynical about New York? Why are we cynical about people helping others in New York? Have you heard of any famous case studies of what happened in New York? We talked about the bystander effect. People don't help others when there are other people around. People have a tendency to help less when they see other people around them. And they refuse responsibility. I'm going to show you a video about this. This is by the BBC. And a TV channel in the US referring to the BBC about what the bystander effect is. And there's a reason why we became so cynical, because since the 1960s, we've heard a lot of case studies and a lot of findings coming from the classic literature in the 1968 regarding the bystander effect. So let's try and summarize what this is about.
Place like this street in New York City, if you were unfortunate enough to be the victim of a crime or taken ill unexpectedly, you might think that surrounded by all these people, someone would intervene. After all, isn't there safety in numbers? Psychologists say no. Research suggests that often a victim is less likely to receive assistance when surrounded by a group rather than a single bystander. When people are in a crowd, it's easier to pass the buck. It's what psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility. Liverpool Street Station in London, a busy thoroughfare for commuters. Unknown to these passers-by, Peter is an actor. As part of an experiment on bystander apathy, he's pretending to be ill.
Help! Help!
How long before he gets help?
Please, somebody. Help! Help me, please help me.
Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for more than 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow.
Please, somebody help me.
It's always very distressing to watch situations like this where people are obviously suffering and no one's actually helping them. But what we have here is two conflicting rules. One is the rule that we ought to help, and the other is the rule that we ought to do what everybody else is doing. And here you have effectively a group of strangers who are exerting the pressure not to intervene, not to help, and it's very difficult to rebel.
Ruth, another actor, takes Peter's place. How long before she receives help? Minutes later, and 34 people have passed without stopping.
Well, people don't really want to know. They just haven't got the time. Well, they have got the time, they just don't want to get involved.
Unwittingly, these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't get involved. They're afraid to stand out from the crowd and won't take action if no one else does. This woman has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing. Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You all right?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, you look a bit clingy, you know what I mean?
She suddenly finds herself in a different group with a new rule: to help.
You want to sit up? You all right, yeah? What's wrong?
First I thought she was dead. Then I checked to see if she was breathing or not. And I looked around and I couldn't believe that no one had noticed her because there was a bloke sat there just absorbed in reading a newspaper.
This time, Peter's dressed as a respectable gentleman. Now that his dress is in keeping with those around him, how long before he's rescued?
Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm all right.
6 seconds. She even calls him sir, and suddenly everyone's a good Samaritan.
Do you suffer from epilepsy?
No.
While you're lying on the floor in the rain?
Because he's part of the right group, everyone wants to help.
I would just hate to be in his position of feeling ill and nobody helping and walking past, so I'd just like to check it was okay.
And I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be ill. He's going to ruin the suit anyway.
So this question about the bystander effect, what happened, what is happening over here, how this assumption that the in-group and the out-groups, they were making the point that if you were assumed, the people around you were assumed, and perhaps they're more likely to help you, but if you look like you're just honest, from poverty, you don't have any, you just stay there, maybe if they are along, maybe other people will think, oh, this is not high, it's not going to be an outlook. The more people that they are, the less likely people are to help. So if we have a drowning child in a pond, it's only us there, maybe high percentages of high likelihood it will help. But if there's other people around that are walking, comes with less likely. So this is the story that we've heard. It started from 1968. 1981, there's already 12, 13 years of people doing a lot of replication and trying this again and again. So people were shocked by this. Like we would expect that if we had an issue, that people would help us. But it seems like more and more studies, this meta has discovered a lot of studies, showing robust effects across all emergency types and population. Helping may increase or decrease because of variety of issues, but the pattern is that there's less helping if there's more people around. And that generally people are not inclined to help, especially if it's a big city, especially when there's a lot of it. Now that you've seen how we address the lost wallets, any questions that you have about the bystander effect? What would you do if you would find replication? What would you ask about this classic finding? First and most obvious thing, so this was done in the 1960s, ending in the 1980s, right? We are now 40 years after that. It's still the case. So is human nature becoming worse? Becoming better? We don't really know. This is still hold. Maybe we need more recent replication, right? So it's not enough that somebody tells us in a TED talk, but this is what they found in the 1960s and the 1980s. We want something more updated. So when you look at the TED Talks in your project one, don't just look at the classic, look at the most recent things. We have a filter on Google Scholar that allows you to see whether something has been conducted in the last 10 years. It's always good to look at the meta-analysis, but don't look at the meta-analysis that was published in 1981, because it's not enough. You want the recent meta-analysis, you want the combination of the evidence most recently published in the last 5 to 10 years. And then you want to look at all kinds of different types of stuff. Where was this done? Was this done only in the Bronx, New York? It's done in Hong Kong. How do we know about whether this is happening all over the globe, or maybe this is happening just with a sample quantity in Princeton or Stanford in the 1960s? So you want to adopt a critical mindset to ask yourself, how do we know that this is the best evidence that we have? And you also want to go and revisit that evidence. So how do we know that these are the findings? We have access to these findings. We see the data. Do we know anything about the context and how they ran this? Which is a real experiment. Perhaps it's something about this context, but it didn't get well. Maybe they're not from New York, so just exactly the same thing that we said about the West and China. Maybe the researchers did something over here that we don't understand. So if we don't have transparency about the way that this was conducted, how can we really draw conclusions from that? So we need to go back and understand how this actually happened.
Her name was Kitty Genovese, a woman whose murder became infamous the world over because nobody tried to save her. Listen to how it was reported.
At least 38 residents of this apartment building heard her screams and did nothing.
That's the legacy of Kitty Genovese, who was murdered in Queens, New York in 1964. Her story is taught in psychology classes, and her name is synonymous with people who look the other way when trouble happens.
Nothing. No witnesses, just a lot of listeners. It's the post-Kitty Genovese era. No one wants to look. They think they'll get involved.
In 1964, Kitty Genovese was murdered outside her home in the middle of the night.
Incredibly, last Sunday's episode of HBO's Girls featured a staged reenactment of the Kitty Genovese case.
Dad, I think there's a lady in the courtyard.
It can't be anything good this time of night.
Hearing of Winston Moseley's death, Girls creator Lena Dunham wrote on Instagram, "Today we learn her killer has died. Spooky timing. Rest in peace, Kitty." So what really happened the night Kitty Genovese was murdered? Kevin Cook is the author of Kitty Genovese, The Murder, the Bystanders, the Crime That Changed America.
The idea that New Yorkers watched and did nothing, didn't lift a finger to help this poor dying girl, stuck in the public mind, but it was a lot more complicated than that.
It happened here. Kitty Genovese was almost home when she heard a man's footsteps behind her. She ran, but the man caught up to her and stabbed her twice in the back. She screamed, "Oh God, I've been stabbed." What happened next? That's where fact and fiction take separate paths.
He fled, she turned and went back around this corner.
Kitty was attacked by a man named Winston Moseley. The author says the fact that she was able to walk after the initial attack probably led people to believe they didn't have to call the cops.
People are looking out their windows. They see Kitty Genovese here. They see her struggle to her feet. She staggers around this corner into the darkness and is no longer visible to the people.
No longer visible to the people over here. It was past 3 a.m. Thinking the trouble was over, people went back to bed. They were unaware that a wounded Kitty Genovese was still in mortal danger.
Kitty sought shelter in here. She was able to get into this door.
That's when Moseley returned and raped and stabbed Kitty to death in this vestibule. According to Cook, a man at the top of the stairs saw it happen, but did nothing to stop it. A tragic story, but it got much worse 2 weeks later when a front-page story in the New York Times declared 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. The author says that number was totally distorted.
There were certainly dozens of ear witnesses and eyewitnesses, but when you talk about the people who both heard something or saw something and knew what it meant, knew what was going on, I don't think it's more than half a dozen.
And Cook says one neighborhood man remembers his dad calling the cops on that fateful night.
He swears that his father did call the police, was put on hold, told the police, there's a woman staggering around out there, she's been beaten up, you need to come. There was no answer to that call. In those days, there was no 911 system. That's something that grew out of the Kitty Genovese case.
So the legend of Kitty Genovese was born.
It led to many sermons in churches. It led to gossip. It went viral in the way that things could in 1964.
Winston Moseley was arrested 6 days after the murder. When he died last week at the age of 81, he'd been denied parole 18 times. He was one of the longest serving inmates in New York State history. As for Kitty Genovese, she will always be remembered for what people didn't do to help her.
The phrase that came out of this was, I didn't want to get involved.
So already you can see, if you know the story about Kitty Genovese, I've learned about this story many, many times from my undergraduate, from my PhD. I heard about this and nobody cared. 38 people saw this and nobody intervened. But it seems like this guy who was investigating this, what he was saying is that 6 people, half a dozen, actually were 3 in the morning, heard enough, to open their windows and see. And out of the 6, one of them, there was no 911, but one of them was looking for the police number, called the police, and told the police that something was happening. So already, this is not exactly the story that I grew up on, and this is not the story that I thought this was. But how far does this go? So this is just the beginning of an understanding of how this was reported. So you can see an academic paper in a very famous journal in psychology called The American Psychologist. Actually, some people in 2007, many, many years later, after 1968, it took until 2007, somebody go and dig up the archive, to see what really happened with Kitty Genovese. So who actually saw this or didn't see this? What actually happened? So you can see they did a very comprehensive investigation of all the evidence that they could find many, many years later, more than 40 years later. And this is what happened. So everything about the story of Kitty Genovese is not supported by the available evidence. Using archival material, the authors show that there's no evidence for the presence of 38 witnesses without the witnesses observed murder, without witnesses remaining active. No evidence for that whatsoever. Granted, it could be that it's because it's 40 years later, so it could be that the archives are incomplete, but you ask yourself, who reported this? The New York Times reported this. Is it accurate? How do we know? The New York Times said something, could be that they had an agenda, maybe there's a bias over there. We don't know. More and more books started to come out since that whole thing happened. And we can see that it reports that the New York Times incorrectly identified 38 indifferent witnesses to the crime, fueling fears of apathy. It seems like the original story was not accurate. Finally, the New York Times got so much backlash for this that the New York Times decided to look at their own archive, and so many years later, we issued a correction. We don't find this correction in the Introduction to Psychology book. We only have the thing from 1964. But here's what they wrote when finally the murderer died. The article grossly exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they had perceived. None saw the attack in its entirety. Only a few had glimpsed part of it or recognized the cries for help. But we're not talking about 38. Nobody saw everything. Some of them saw something. Many thought they had heard lovers or drunks quarreling. They didn't understand that somebody was in danger. There were 2 attacks, not 3, and afterwards 2 people called the police, not 1. So out of the 6, 2 people called the police in an age where there was no 911. And finally, a 70-year-old woman at 3 in the morning ventured out and cradled the dying victim in her arms until they arrived. The help arrived. Died in her arms on the way to the hospital. This is apathy. This is nobody caring. This is not the story that I heard about. Out of the 6 that maybe could put something together at 3 in the morning, not thinking of the novel story, 2 called the police, and 1 70-year-old woman, knowing that there is danger, went down and helped the woman. Maybe this is the story. This is not what we heard about. So we need to go back and revisit the evidence. One neighbor actually raced from her apartment to rescue Miss Genovese, knowing that she was in distress, unaware whether that statement was there or not there. So don't only read the original. Go and see what actually happened there. Go and revisit the archives. Go and revisit the evidence. Finally, it's clear that she went to great efforts to save and comfort Kitty, giving the lie to the idea that no one helped and no one cared. So this is an unbelievable story. So we need to change everything about the Introduction to Psychology and Social Psychology books. I don't know why we don't have more updated information. Finally, the bystander effect. Now we have an updated meta-analysis, not from the 1980s. So people went back to revisit all the evidence. And what did they find? Something very, very surprising. It seems like this group of researchers finally found from over 7,700 participants in 105 independent effect sizes, overall effect size of minus 0.35. So it does seem like there is an inclination when there are more people around for people not to help. But don't just look at the main effect. There are moderators, and the moderators really matter. So when you read a meta-analysis like this, keep on reading. The bystander effect was moderated when situations were perceived as dangerous. People were more likely to help when the situation was perceived as dangerous. They didn't help if they didn't think it was danger. If there was danger, they were more likely to help. In addition, the attackers were present. So if the attackers were present, they were more likely to intervene. The cost of the intervention of intervening were physical. So people were putting themselves more to intervene when there was actually a threat of physical danger. So this is exactly the kind of typical thing where we were led to believe one thing, all the classics, everything that I learned in my undergraduate and my PhD, and then later when you read the updated evidence, when you look at an updated meta-analysis, you realize that the story is completely different. Finally, came up a very interesting study that took a different approach to this. So instead of doing a study where they manipulate things in a slightly controlled way, a group of researchers, sociologists, not psychologists, did something different. They took a lot of CCTV footage. They tried to analyze any time there was a problem and somebody was in danger, did people intervene or not? So what did they find? Is it more aligned with the 1960s, 80s, or is it more aligned with the meta-analysis from 2007? This is what they found.
Individuals that are only interested in our own interests. That is not how it works. The myth is that when people observe somebody in need of help in public, then they have a tendency to kind of just stand there and look at each other. Our research shows that that's not at all what's happening. from pretty low-scale conflicts to stabbings and really severe violence. In all types of situations, they try to de-escalate the conflict. They put themselves between the conflict parties, trying to pull them apart. So is it always a good idea to play an active role? You know, is it also a good idea to be active if you are in an armed robbery situation? We were surprised by the high frequency of it, and we were also surprised by seeing similar frequencies in these 3 different countries that we looked at. As a cultural anthropologist, I would have expected pretty big cultural differences, but what we see is that there are some universal features in these very tense situations. A lot of social psychologists would be pretty upset if I would say that I disproved it. In many ways, I think we did, but the point is that they've been looking at something else than what we've been looking at. So our point now is a bit, now with the CCTV footage, we can actually gain understanding of human behavior in a way that we haven't been able to get before. Violence and aggression, you can't study that in a lab setting. The urgency is different in real life. So that idea if you stumble when you enter the subway and people will not help you, I mean, that's not what we see. That's an idea that we all have, but that's not how the reality works.
I think this is really encouraging, and I really like the study. So moving into examining real evidence in CCTV, and then more and more people started to run the same kind of things to try and understand. So overall, in different places in the world, they ran this in 3 different countries, and then replications, looking at CCTV from other different places in the world. So actually, if anything, intervention is the norm. 90%. Not just 1%, 3 to 4 people intervene. If anything, this goes against the police advice saying, please don't intervene, call us. People actually put themselves in physical danger in order to help other people. So we started from the subway hero, and he dove in order to help the other person with a train coming in. This is one example of a baby falling into a ditch over there in the subway, and a lot of people coming in and trying to help. A lot of people are willing to put themselves in danger in order to help other people against the advice of police. This is not the story that I heard during the last working technology in my undergrad, and this is not the story that I looked at when I read all the research from the 1960s and 80s. So first we have to go back and see whether the original findings are solid or not. We need to look at updated information, and then we also need to see other ways of examining things, not only in a lab or not only control setting, but also CCTV with the checklists. So I find this to be inspiring. Overall, at the end, for example, in the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and South Africa, they show that 9 out of 10 public conflicts, at least one bystander, but typically several, will do something to help. Here we have another one, so a replication of this. So people are 19 times more likely to intervene if there's danger involved. So in the presence of dangerous bystanders were more likely to intervene than in the absence of a problem. So I think this is a very optimistic, hopeful story about the way that we are as a society. We're not all in apathy. We see the story of the past, not again, but it's just wrong. A lot of evidence, and I will move on to a different one. This is a problematic story. I have to say that this is especially painful. This year, Zimbardo, the person who ran the Stanford prison experiment, he passed away. And I think in the eyes of a lot of people, he's kind of a hero. In the eyes of many social psychologists, he's a very problematic figure, very questionable. We debated a lot what to do with Zimbardo and the Stanford experiment. But I'll just say, generally, we have a problem with this because we believe this to be just state experiment. It's not really an experiment. They're a little bit like a fraud. So a lot of things about this so-called experiment seem to be reported badly and staged. So here we have Simin Vazir. Simin Vazir is now the editor of one of our most reputable journals in psychological science. He's one of the advocates for science reform and public science. She wrote this on her Twitter, and I very much agree with this. Psychologists read this. We must stop celebrating this work. It's anti-scientific. Get it out of the textbooks. We should not be teaching the Stanford prison experiment. The only reason to teach this is how not to do science. There's a lot of issues with this. So I'll just show you the main article in the video. Saying Stanford prison experiment was a fraud, scientist says.
I had really thought that I was incapable of this kind of behavior.
I gotta go to a doctor, anything. Jesus Christ, I'm burning out
more like a bunch of kids doing improv. So good that he taped the archive, so we can go and listen back to the recordings. It's good that we can go and still interview a lot of people that were part of this, both the jailers, the prisoners, and people who were involved in putting this together. But there's a lot of stuff there. So now it's very clear to us that a lot of elements in this were fraud. It started from this article, but since that article came out, a lot of accumulating evidence. Zimbardo was trying to push back on this and had a lot of excuses for all kinds of things, but to us it just seems like this whole thing is really not credible. Many of them were trained. It seemed like they were doing a simulation of this a few weeks before that. Many of them were graduate students, so they needed the Zimbardo to sign off on their recommendation letter. There's like a lot of things that just went very, very wrong. The so-called random assignment of people being prisoners or jailers need to be completely flawed. So all of this is it's not an experiment. It's not as was reported. Everything that was said about this needs to be retracted and taken out of the textbooks. Unfortunately, when we talk about human nature in social psychology, what people actually remember is the Stanford Prison experiment. There's lots of things in the slides. I won't go into this, but you're welcome to just go and read about this a little bit more. I'll just show you the headlines that came out of this. Stanford Prison experiment was massively influential. We now learn that this was a fraud, completely flawed, and might be wrong. So this is how we do this whole thing. Did we take things out from the introduction to psychology here at HBU? Did we change something about the textbook, social psychology? We didn't, I don't know why, but this is what we need to teach students. And then we need to teach them what is wrong about this study. There's a lot of discussions about the ethics about this whole thing, but not just the part of this relating, but the part about this being very flawed and to the point of being flawed. So if you want to read a scientific article about this, here you can go and read this one, also published in American Psychologist, that seems to revisit a lot of these classic articles. And here is the document showing that the Stanford Prison experiment is wrong. So we don't just have headlines in the social media and in the newspapers, but we also have an academic article that shows all the criticisms, biased, incomplete collection of data, the extent to which drew from an experiment that was conducted by the students in classes 3 months earlier, facts that they got to receive precise instructions on how to be bad. It's like everything about this is very, very troubling. So if you want to know more, here's an academic article summarizing this whole thing. And most recently, worthwhile, I don't know if you have subscription to these things, but there's a movie that came out, tries to just show all the story about this being a very, very bad study, and how we all fell into the trap of believing this study. So this is the summary of people who say human nature is very, very bad. Look at what happened in Stanford Prison experiment. Even if you believe the Stanford Prison experiment, still, I think this cartoon really takes the point of. So 20 people in Stanford, back then in the 1970s, this is how you conclude something for the entire human nature of all people during all generations. So this may view of human nature on a 6-day long study of 22 non-random young males in which the experimenter was an active participant. So what we want to ask about this is that, okay, so that study was bad, but do we have anything else that we know about the Stanford Prison? Can we run verifications of this? Let's see.
I'm thinking of some real life example, like the war that happened in Nanjing during the war after and the soldiers that in their homeland, they can be really kind people and be very nice in nature, but they just happen to be from in the war in the group of like other soldiers. It's also coming from the instruction from the king or their supervisors or something, but it's also from their team.
So we need to be very careful with jumping to the conclusion that human nature is good. Definitely that's not the point I'm trying to make. So hold on with this thought. We will get to it. We have one more famous study to cover. But what we need to understand is that we thought that perhaps these classic science studies say something about Nanjing, about the Japanese, or about the Germans, or about all the war that happens in the world. But it seems like we were led to believe a story that is not true. So if we want to understand what actually happened in Nanjing or in Germany or in other places in the world, then we need a different way to tap into this, to try to understand what these people feel what they ordered. Very good that we need to ask these questions, but we need to rely on solid evidence. Okay? And this is not it. Stanford Prison experiment is not. So I'm taking you one by one. So we talked about bystander effect, and now we're talking about Stanford Prison experiment. We have one more. I'll get to it in a second. I just want to conclude this one. We want to know whether we can run replications of the Stanford Prison experiment, but we have an ethical problem. Putting people in this kind of situation is not ethical. We had this problem before, right? With a trolley putting somebody in a real situation where they think they might hurt people, right? Remember how the reaction was of the person who was involved in this? So we can't run this again. We can't find ethical approval for this. And when we can't find ethical approval for this, for scientists to run this study, what do? We have a TV show that does this. So there was a TV show, you can go and see that TV show. It's called The Experiment. So actually, they reran the Stanford Prison Experiment once again, and they had researchers be involved in this. And this is the abstract, and this is the replication that came out in 2011 to try and run this 50 years later. What happened with the Stanford Prison Experiment? I'm not going to go into this. There's also a video in the slides if you want to later watch this, but I'll just summarize this for you. The upside is, unlike the prisoners, the guards failed to identify with their roles. Very different from the Stanford Prison Experiment. This made the guards reluctant to impose their authority, and they were eventually overcome by the prisoners. So there was a revolution within the prison, and they overcame them. Participants then established an egalitarian social system. Egalitarian social system is like where everybody is equal, sitting down together, holding hands and singing songs. This is the replication of the Stanford Prison Experiment showing, but this did not happen the way that it happened before. However, this is a downside to this. When this proved unsustainable, so egalitarian society where everybody holds hands and sings songs together did not last very long, and this is where the human nature really backfires. What happened? They moved to impose a tyranny, a regime with weakening resistance. Over time, I guess they were bored with each other, or they wanted a little bit more order. So out of the democracy, egalitarian society, emerged a tyranny, authoritarian regime. So I strongly recommend you go and listen to it, because it's fascinating. So once again, TV show comes to the rescue, trying to replicate a study that is ethically questionable, but finding something that is very surprising. Not what we were there to do about Stanford Prison Experiment. Take of this what you will, but my main conclusion is be very, very skeptical of what's in the books. How about Milgram? What happened with Milgram? I would have liked to come and tell you human nature is great. I would really like to come to this conclusion. However, Milgram, unfortunately, replicates very, very well. People administer deadly shocks to people just because the person in the white book tells them to. So obedience seems like when giving instructions, being in extreme situations, people tend to perform. People tend to yes, even when it means hurting somebody else. So this is one of the replications that came up. So in the 1960s and 70s, we had the Milgram experiment showing that 79% of participants went all the way to the end to administer electric shocks to other people, despite the other person saying that, asking them to stop, just because the person in the experiment, the person in the lab told them to proceed. How about if we run this 45 years later? Obedience rates in the 2006 replication were only slightly lower. So we can still replicate Milgram, and this is not the only one. Once again, we have a team shot, and they ran this kind of thing again. I don't know if you're familiar with Darren Brown, but he does some very extreme stuff. Here, he was trying to do a heist of a bank. He was trying to find people who were psychotic enough in order to help him do this heist. And in order to test this, he gave them the Milgram experiment paradigm. So I suggest you go and look at the entire episode. Fascinating stuff. I'll just share the brief version.
In the original Milgram experiment, psychologists were asked to predict how many people would continue to the point that they were administering the highest shock on the board. Their prediction was 0.1%. They were wrong. The results of our experiment were almost identical to the original. Over 50% of participants continued up to 450 volts. The majority of people will administer lethal electric shocks just because a guy in a white coat is telling them to.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450.
So Darren here was expecting maybe 1 or 2 people to administer electric shocks all the way to the end, but he found like 50% of participants that he put in this situation kind of did the same thing. We also do a meta-analysis, a very recent meta-analysis, same guy from the Stanford Prison Experiment, and here you can see that over 23 of these people who were trying to replicate Milgram found very, very disturbing results. Obedience involved progression to maximum voltage in an overall rate of 43.6%. Well, not everybody, but 43.6% being told to hurt somebody else, hearing that the other person is shouting, still administering electric shocks all the way to being very deadly. Many applications in various places around the world, very, very disturbing stuff. If you want to see more and more applications in this slide. So when it comes to you looking at your project one, there's a claim over there, then have a look and see, are there applications, what is the rate of applications, is there meta-analysis of the applications, then see if something is credible or not credible. So all the classic findings that we talked about today, it seems like we debunked the bystander effect, the Kitty Genovese story, the Stanford prison experiment, which is complete fraud. So we debunked those, but it seems like we also know how to establish that something is credible. In the case of Milgram, it's very clear, this replicates very well. It seems like there are findings to show us that some of human nature is corruptible when there is an authority, when somebody moves completely insane up on top telling them how to behave. So hopefully this gives you kind of a taste of how we think about things in social psychology regarding human nature. It's still an ongoing debate. What is human nature? So we've got Rutger on one side, they're being very, very optimistic, but then we see Milgram experiments on the other side, and then just opening the news every day, looking at what's happening around the world. Then it gets you to question human nature. So we need more evidence, and we need more people like you to come in and conduct rigorous research in order to help us understand human nature a little bit better. But what's nice about social psychology compared to all the other kinds of psychology is that we really look at what's happening, what are the socioeconomic, cultural factors that affect whether people do that, what is going on. We look at an interaction between an experimenter and a participant in a social situation about whether people help one another. That's what's really fascinating about social psychology. It's not in a lab, having the actual kind of stimuli that comes at you. It's real life situations where we analyze things like CCTV in order to see what people will help on. Social psychology is very, very complicated, but it gets to the heart, fundamental issues like what is human nature and when does human nature change. So this is my conclusion to this. No clear evidence that human nature is bad. I reject completely the Stanford prison experiment and the bystander effect is completely the opposite of what I was taught to believe. Classic findings could be very biased and flawed, so don't take anything for granted. Raise questions, put on the scientists' hat, raise some concerns if you see something that's happening. But we do have some applications that show that there is the ability to corrupt people with a known experiments. So authority and power are corrupt, and we also see ego output leads people to behave in all sorts of different ways. So I protect my ego, but if the guy doesn't wear a suit and I wear a suit, or if it's a person from a different country, I protect my own first, even if it's at the expense of somebody from the output. So ego output seems to be very, very strong, and obedience to authority and power seems to be a big factor. Finally, final words are not going to be from me, but from Dr. Feldman. I really suggest that you go and read his book. Highly recommended, and a very optimistic conclusion to what I feel is the history of the research in social psychology about mankind.
My name is Rutger Bregman, and I'm the author of the new book, Humankind, A Hopeful History. It's a book about a simple but quite radical idea. What if most people, deep down, are pretty decent? In the past 15 to 20 years, there has been a silent revolution in science. Scientists from very diverse disciplines, psychologists, anthropologists, archaeologists, sociologists, have moved from a quite cynical view of human nature to a much more positive and hopeful view, and have actually been arguing that we are hardwired to be friendly and to cooperate, and that actually this is our true superpower as a species. Now, I think this is a quite revolutionary idea, because what you assume in other people is what you get out of them. If you assume that most people deep down are just selfish, as we have been assuming for the past 30 to 40 years, then you'll start designing your institutions around that idea, right? Your schools, your workplaces, your democracies, and that's what you get out of people. What you assume in other people is what you get out of them. Now, if we move to a new, more hopeful, more realistic view of human nature, I think that changes everything. And it's also a quite subversive idea, because if we don't trust each other, if we think that, people are deep down are just selfish, then we need them, then we need the CEOs and the presidents and the bureaucrats and the generals and the monarchs and the kings and you name it. We need those in power to keep each other in check. But if we actually believe in each other, if we believe that most people can be trusted, then we can move to a very different kind of society, a much more egalitarian kind of society where, we bring out the best in each other. That's the simple but quite radical idea that I'm defending in my book, Humankind, A Hopeful History. Now, It's a strange time to be publishing a book. I've worked on this for 5 years. For 5 years, I've tried to connect the dots, and I'm just trying to show that there's something bigger going on here, because there's so many brilliant specialists who have been working on this new view of human nature, but they often don't realize from each other that they're not alone. So at one point, I was interviewing a psychologist who had been doing fascinating work on the so-called bystander theory, which is the idea that during times of crises, or when there's an emergency, say someone's drowning or someone's attacked in the street, that we don't help. And this psychologist actually showed that in 90% of all cases, based on CCTV camera footage, right? So real incidents, in 90% of all cases, people actually help each other. And so I told her about new theories from biology, where biologists lately have been talking about the concept of survival of the friendliest, which has been happening in our evolution. That for thousands of years, it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids and so had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. And I told her about this, and she said, "Oh my God, so it's been happening there as well." And this is the only thing that I've been trying to do, is just to connect the dots, to show that there's something bigger going on, that the zeitgeist is changing and that we're moving into a new era right now.
Very helpful message from him. Different disciplines, not just in psychology, but also in sociology and in biology. Talks about the homo puppy. So we are not homo sapiens, but we were ingrained in our genes to help one another care for each other. Perhaps more so about the in-group than globally, but our in-group is increasing all the time. So a lot of what we'll see here in this course is about algorithms, people trying to help one another care for each other and have a global impact. So for your task, when you plan ahead, please make sure that you establish your foundation, something that is solid, with critical mindset, and see what it is that you come out with when you investigate all the information about pro-social behavior, morality, and operations. And we look forward to your questions if you have any. If you find us on Gilad, as you make progress with your projects, please do reach out to us. Let us know what we can do.